Gentlemen, welcome to today's virtual session when the continent will be presented with its progress report almost 6 years after nearly all governments across the world began the journey to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. With great resolve, UN member states adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs, as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, for a better future, a more sustainable future. The SDGs are expected to drive national and global development agendas over a period of 15 years, and we are nearly halfway point to 2030. What does the report tell us? How close is Africa to achieving the SDGs? So ladies and gentlemen, the Afrobarometer SDG scorecard is launching today. It provides a unique perspective to the measurement of progress in Africa, the views of ordinary African citizens who are in fact the intended beneficiaries of the SDGs. My name is Solomon Mugera. I'm your host for the next nearly 90 minutes. I'm in conversation with a great lineup of guests with the expertise in the issues we'll be discussing today. We've got Dr. Joseph Asunka, he's the CEO of Afrobarometer. We've got Dr. Mo Ibrahim, the founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. We've got Oliver Chinganya. Oliver is the director at the African Center for Statistics at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. And Oliver's kindly accepted to represent Dr. Vera Songwe, who sends apologies for not being able to attend this launch as earlier advertised. And then we have got Honorable Margot Wallström, former Swedish Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. And just some house rules before we go on. The session is being recorded and streamed live on Facebook. Participants can choose the translation feature to hear the translated audio in either English or French, and we've got two interpreters with us. There's Patrick, who is translating from English to French, and then we've got Felix, who is doing vice versa. The social media hashtag for these conversations are hashtag Voices Africa and hashtag SDGs. And participants can use the Q&A function on your Zoom there, on your webinar there, to type in your questions, and I will try to read some of them during the Q&A session. So right now, ladies and gentlemen, let us tuck into the SDG scorecard. Let us see what it looks like, what it reads like. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Solomon. This is really great, and thanks for the excellent introduction. I really appreciate what you've done. And I also want to acknowledge and thank our esteemed guests here today, who are here to share with us, one, their perspectives about the Sustainable Development Goals, as Solomon has articulately presented, and also to share their views about Africa's progress towards these goals. Solomon has already mentioned these are goals that were adopted in 2015, and the purpose of these goals was to make sure that we end poverty and that everybody lives in peace and prosperity by 2030. And if you look at it, we are now 20 years in. And the question is, where is Africa now in terms of progress? And that is the question that brings us to today. So tracking progress towards these Sustainable Development Goals, as you will all know, is not an easy task. It's really a tough one to pull off. But there are several scorecards that are out there that are used to track progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. What the Afrobarometer does is to bring a unique perspective into these debates and discussions. And our perspective is bringing people's voices into these discussions and efforts. And how do we do this? Well, we just go out and ask people about their experiences on the ground. And what we believe is this, that if our measurements are to reflect exactly how we are making progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, they ought to include what the people feel and think. And that is a complement that Afrobarometer brings to the Sustainable Development Goals tracking process. Now, let me turn briefly to just talk about some of the Sustainable Development Goals that we track. as we all know, there are 17 goals in total, and the Afrobarometer has data that can track progress towards 12 of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. When Afrobarometer started off in 1999, our signature topic by then was governance and democracy. But over time, we have collected data that, as I mentioned, we can track up to 12 of the 17 indicators, as you can see on your screen. These are the 12 indicators that we can track with our data. In addition to these, our signature SDG, which is the governance and democracy, we also have data that we capture on poverty, health, education, energy supply, water and sanitation, infrastructure, gender and inequality, among other relevant SDG indicators. To date, 7 rounds of surveys have been completed since 1999, and we've done all these surveys in about 38 countries across the continent. Around 8 surveys are just about wrapping up, and we are now preparing to go to the field for around 9 surveys, hoping to start sometime in July or August. I should note here that all our data can be disaggregated by several demographic factors, including gender, age, ethnicity, urban, rural location, among others. Now, I'll talk briefly about our signature goal, our signature SDG, which is the governance and democracy. So for us at Afrobarometer, this is really core to the business we do. And this was a founding basis for Afrobarometer. If you look at this table here, goal 16 talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. The second column lists the target indicator by the SDGs, there's SDG indicator. And if you look at the last column, the third column here lists the indicator that Afrobarometer uses to track the SDG indicator. So for each of the 12 Sustainable Development Goals, we look at the targets for those goals, and we have questions from our surveys that can directly measure progress towards those goals, those targets. Now, we do have data on other goals as well. And for this particular presentation, we're going to focus on both our signature topic, which is democracy and governance. We're also going to talk about goal 1, which is about poverty, ending poverty. We'll talk about goal 2, which it talks about hunger, ending hunger. And we'll also deal with goal 3, that is specifically on healthcare and well-being. We'll also touch on education as well. But as I go through, I'm going to sample other indicators that we are able to track so that we get a clear flavor of some of the indicators that we are able to track at Afrobarometer. And so the other measures that we'll deal with, as I said, it will be SDG 2, which is on health. We'll look at the frequency of going without hunger, which is about ending hunger. And we'll also look at education, as I mentioned. All right, now let me walk you through a selection of some of the country scorecards briefly. So we present the scorecards in 3 formats, and I'll just briefly describe what those formats look like. First, we have indicators that shows the detailed data that we have on each indicator. And these details just gives us a reflection of what happens at the country level. The second level is just a summary for each country, which gives you a snapshot of the direction of travel of a given country over time. And then we also present a continental picture, which allows you to see broadly across the continent, where is Africa going? Let me caveat here and say, the summary results are easier to read, and it gives different levels of people like how to interpret, first of all, where the continent is going. Secondly, within each country, the direction of travel for each country. And then the detailed data then allows us to think about what exactly can be done to address, or at least to advance progress towards the SDGs. So I'll start with Botswana. We're using a sample of 6 countries to give you a flavor. All these SDG scorecards will be published on our website, but I'm going to select just 6 countries to give you a flavor of what you should expect to see in the SDGs. So starting with Botswana, if you look at the top right left corner here, this is what we use our lived poverty to measure. So a lived poverty index is an index that we create from several variables in our data set. And when you see here, Botswana seems to have made some progress in reducing poverty over time. Between 2008 and 2019, we see a decline there. The same way, if you look at the number of people who went without food, which is ending hunger, as according to the SDGs, this one too, we see some improvement in Botswana. There's a decline over time in the number of people who report that they go many times or always without food. Also, if you look at the top, under the bottom right corner on quality education, we see there's a gradual trending up of the proportion of people who have had at least secondary or higher education. But I should note here that there's a small gap between men and women in educational attainment. Now let me move on to Togo. And as I mentioned earlier, I said we're going to be sampling different indicators to give you a flavor of the kinds of indicators we can cover. And so for Togo, we are looking at gender inequality. And here, if you look at in terms of access to mobile phones and the internet service, and we're also focusing on financial decision making. Overall, over the period between 2012 and 2021, the use of mobile phones have shot up. The same way we see a gradual increase in internet use. But if you look at this one, you would realize that men are consistently doing better than women. When it comes to financial decision making within households, comparing 2017 and 2021, we see there's a major shift in joint decision making in families compared to the previous time. Now let me move next to Nigeria and look at a few indicators as well. In Nigeria, I start with clean water and sanitation. For clean water, the proportion without enough clean water, those who report that they have always gone without clean water or many times, has actually increased in the past few years. So this is a sign of a deterioration in Nigeria. The same way, if we look at affordable clean energy, which is on the bottom left, SDG 7, the proportion of Nigerians who have reliable electricity has actually declined slightly over time. In the same way, if you look at decent work and economic growth, which touches on SDG 8, here we also see that unemployment has held quite steady, but just that the gender gap has only slightly decreased over time. Now let me turn to Kenya. In Kenya, I focus on SDG 10, which deals with inequality. In Kenya, if you look at the top right corner, first of all, the number of people who experience moderate or high levels of hunger has actually decreased between 2008 and 2014, but then it has now risen almost to the same level as it was previously in 2008. So Kenya seems to be doing quite badly when it comes to reducing economic inequality. But then when we look at ethnic inequality, and ethnic inequality here, this is how Afrobarometer measures it. We ask people whether or not they think the government treats their ethnic group badly or differently. And here we do see some kind of improvement, that there has been a decline in the people who say their ethnic groups have been treated badly over time. So there's great improvement in that sense. And when we talk of climate change, there is a lot of knowledge about climate change in Kenya. Even though we just have 2 data points, it does show that there's some trending up, that people know about climate change and they do know the negative impacts of climate change on their lives in Kenya. Finally, I'll look at Morocco. Here, we are looking at just institutional trust, and this is core to our signature SDG, which is governance and democracy. So institutional trust in Morocco has risen over time between 2012 and 2021. And then we also see that perceptions about corruption in Morocco have declined over time. And this may suggest some kind of inverse relationship between trust in institutions and perceptions of corruption in those institutions. Now, for each of these indicators, what we do is, as I mentioned, that gives you the detailed picture for each country. So for each indicator, we can have all these details about the particular indicator and the direction in which the country is going. But then we also produce a summary of the scorecards. And the summaries are meant mainly to both to make it easier to read, to understand where the country is going specifically. And then also we produce the summaries for the continent, which also gives us a snapshot of continental progress. And here what we do is we use a stoplight as an indicator of whether or not countries are making progress or retreating. So for countries where there's good performance, if there's improvement, you will see one colored circle. And then if there's deterioration, you see the other. We use red to indicate that the country is retrogressing or retreating on that indicator. If there's a yellow, that means that there's no change at all. It's not significant change on that indicator. And when there's an improvement, we use green dots. And then, of course, when a country is actually meeting the SDG, we use a blue circle. There are some cases where you will see a half-filled circle, and the half just means that there's mixed results in a particular indicator. So, for example, if in a country, education is going up, it's improving, but that it is improving for only men, but stagnated or deteriorated for women, we use a half-filled circle to show that the results for that indicator are mixed. So now let me just briefly run through a few of the summary scorecards for each country. So for each country, we take all the indicators for the SDGs, and then we use a stoplight to indicate whether or not the country is making progress, retrogressing, or stagnant. If you look at Botswana first, here we do see several green circles. We also see a number of red circles. And what it is telling us for each green circle is that Botswana is making progress on those indicators, and the red circles that it is retrogressing. Here, I'll first of all touch on the blue circle, because this is what we hardly have on our SDG scorecards. So Botswana is almost hitting the target, it's hitting the target, I should say, when it comes to gender equality. And the blue circle on this scorecard is on gender equality. And so Botswana is both reaching high levels of gender equality. The country is, of course, is also doing quite well when it comes to financial control and moving towards equality in mobile phone use, and then also internet use. These are the indicators we use. So asset ownership and the use of technology. And we also see that they are doing quite well when it comes to reducing poverty, which is the top indicator, which is green, and also hunger as well, which is the third point, which is green. But then we see that some of the red circles are here that indicate that the country has slipped a bit when it comes to access to medical care, clean water, reducing gender gaps in employment, and promoting institutional trust. All these are red, indicating that there is a slippage over the last 5 years. Now let's turn to Nigeria and see how that scorecard looks like. So for Nigeria, over the past 5 years, we've seen quite a significant reduction and retreating on several of the indicators, as you will see here. We have quite a number of red dots here. So when it comes to hunger, poverty, and access to healthcare, we'll see that Nigeria is not doing too well on those indicators. But then we do see some progress on the green circles here, which are gender gaps in employment, reducing ethnic inequality, and actually reducing perceived corruption in institutions. Nigeria seems to have done well over time. Now I'll turn to Morocco, and this is the summary scorecard for Morocco. In Morocco, and I would say this, Morocco is one of the few countries that have actually done well when it comes to hunger, poverty, and access to healthcare. So all the top 4 are all in green, showing that there's a progress over the last 5 years. But the challenges remain, especially with regard to gender gaps in education and employment. So the red dot here touches on the gender gaps in education and employment. And then I'll look at the summary for Togo. And in Togo as well, we're seeing there's also significant progress towards ending hunger, tackling poverty, and increasing access to healthcare, all green at the top there. But then there's a mixed record when it comes to our signature SDG, which is democracy and governance. Trust in institutions has declined, and perceptions about corruption in institutions have also dropped. Now let's turn to Kenya, finally. So for Kenya, Kenya is not also doing too well when it comes to fighting hunger, dealing with poverty, and also access to healthcare. All these four stay red here, showing that Kenya has moved back in terms of its progress towards these SDGs. But overall, we do see some kind of improvements if you look at the green dots, which touches on climate change in particular, where Kenya is doing quite well when it comes to climate change awareness. All right, so that gives you a picture of how each country's scorecard looks like, and that is what we use to indicate the direction of travel for each country. And so when you take a scorecard for Kenya or any country that you pick, for the stoplight, that gives you an indication of the direction of travel of that particular country. But the final way we present the scorecard is the continental picture. It gives you an overview of the continental progress on each of the indicators that we have. And so we will take one indicator and have all the countries listed and then indicate the direction that the continent is going. So when you talk of no poverty or ending poverty, this is how the picture looks like continent-wide. And now let me caveat here that we provide these summary scorecards to aid ease of reading and also to give an initial picture of where either a country is going or the continent is going. But note that this is not for comparison across countries. The comparisons have to be made within countries. So they are a reflection of the country's progress from 2015 to date. So we should not take a country like country A, Kenya, and compare it to country B, Morocco, and then say one country is doing better than the other. That is not the purpose of the scorecard. The purpose of the scorecard is to reflect the country's change over time. And so the comparison is within country and not across countries. But of course, these summary results do provide an initial picture that allows people to then dig into and find out what exactly is happening in a particular country. So when we take lift poverty here, we see that across all of them, we have several countries. This is about 18 of the countries that have actually experienced a decline in lift poverty across the continent. And this is a major decline over the last 5 years for fighting poverty on the continent. One might say, well, we conducted some of these surveys during the COVID period. And so poverty may have increased and hunger may have increased partly because of the COVID-19. But I should state here that we have a puzzle, which of course we'll be addressing in subsequent surveys, that even though we see, we surveyed some of these countries before COVID and we surveyed some of them during the pandemic when the lockdowns were lifted. And there is no indication that that was the case, because for the countries that were surveyed before COVID, about 12 of them, poverty actually deteriorated. And then the countries we surveyed afterwards, a few of those countries actually saw improvements in poverty and hunger. And so we do not yet clearly have an indication that COVID during this period has actually impacted poverty or hunger or even access to healthcare. But as I said, this is a puzzle for us to think through, like, why do we have this? Is it because the effects are not yet felt, or government interventions may have moderated some of the effects? This is the debate that needs to be had, but also a research question for us going forward. All right, so this is no poverty. If you look at health as well, The picture is somewhat, the picture is almost similar when it comes to good health. 17 of the 25 countries, including 11 that were surveyed before COVID-19 hit, were clearly improving. It clearly improved only in 2 countries, but 17 of these countries actually experienced a deterioration when it came to health and well-being. And we'll look at quality education. On quality education, the picture looks brighter here. And that's one bright spot for us when we did these indicators, that there's quite a movement on the front on education, that lots of countries are making gains when it comes to education. We only have a few countries that have deteriorated over the time. But of course, we should know that several other countries have recorded mixed results. That's 14 half circles here, which is an indication that there may be progress, but there are differences, especially across men and women. And then when we look at SDG 16, which is our signature Sustainable Development Goals, peace, justice, and strong institutions. The trust in the judiciary, parliament, and the police has experienced some retrogression across the board, except in 2 countries where we see a full progress. And those countries are Morocco and Ghana, where we see there's progress in terms of trust in institutions. But for several countries, this indicator has actually experienced a lot of deterioration. And then when we tend to look at the indicator on perceived corruption in these institutions, the picture is almost similar. Perceived corruption seems to have deteriorated across several countries over the last 5 years. So these indicators do give us an overall picture of the direction of travel. As we look across all these indicators, we see that education has been the most improved across the continent, but the 3 other indicators that we've looked here, there has been a retrogression over the last 5 years. But as I noted earlier, if you are looking at these indicators and need to take action, the summary pictures give us an indication as to the direction of travel. But if you really want to understand what is happening in a country, the detailed scores is what makes sense to look at. And so looking at the detailed scores then allows people to begin to ask the questions, what should be done to ensure that country A actually delivers on hunger or delivers on addressing access to healthcare. All right, so as you look at Kenya here, just repeating it here for everybody to see that when you look at Kenya's scorecard, this is more helpful when it comes to talking about policy issues in Kenya. And when you go to the detailed scores, it then allows you to look at each country and say, okay, this is the area that we need an intervention, and this is the type of policy intervention we would need to be able to drive a particular country forward. All right, so this is the detailed picture as we show here. And so the preference is to start with the details, which is the right lines that you see here, the red and blue lines, and then you can work your way back to the summary. So it just gives you a bigger summary picture for each country, and then also a broader continent-wide picture. Just one quick note about the launch. We start today with the Continental launch, and thank you all for making it to this event. We are really grateful for your time. We'll do several launches in the coming days, starting on 7th June in Anglophone West Africa, and then it will run all the way through to Southern Africa on the 20th of July. And you'll have this both on our website, but also the events will be advertised. And I hope that some of you will be able to make it, that we can have a deeper dive into some of the indicators in across all these regions. So just to conclude, we know that the SDGs are meant as a tool to improve people's lives. There are several indicators out there, as I remarked at the beginning, but the Afrobarometer scorecard does bring a unique perspective, which is people's views. And this perspective is often missing when it comes to development, not progress. And we think there's a need to bring back people's voices into this effort. What our hope is that the assessments would stimulate debates, help to identify some of the gaps that exist in terms of people's experiences and what the data says, and also to support action in moving forward in each country. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for all the time you've spent with us, and I'll turn it back over to Solomon for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joseph. That deep dive was very useful. And I'm sure pens or iPads and other gadgets were busy getting the gist of your presentation. Yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel. You mentioned that SDG number 4, quality education. But man, there's so many red lights flickering across Africa. Let's just start with that SDG number 1, poverty, ending poverty. And I will now turn to our panelists and first bring in Dr. Mo Ibrahim, founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. You are particularly passionate about poverty elevation in Africa. And to just throw in one other statistic, the African Development Bank's 2020 economic outlook says poverty is declining at a much lower pace in Africa than elsewhere in the developing world. Very little progress on poverty. What do you make of what you're seeing, Dr. Mo Ibrahim? You're on mute. You're on mute still, Dr. Ibrahim. Hello, Mo. You're on mute. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Solomon, and please call me Mo. There's no need for titles here between friends.
Yes.
I really wish to start by really thanking Afrobarometer for the work they're doing. I value a lot their efforts, and actually we have been using Afrobarometers to build part of our index of African governance, especially the voice of citizens, which is quite missing most of the data actually. So this wonderful African organization, which needs support, and we hope that it will continue doing its work and expand it actually. So thank you to start with. Mm-hmm. And talking of poverty, I don't know what to say. I mean, I recall a conversation we had some years ago about the Millennium Development Goals. You remember, guys, the Millennium Development Goals? Mm-hmm. And Kofi Annan said we're going to have poverty, you know, and at the end, really, we didn't know if we have poverty or not, for a simple reason. We didn't have data. We don't know. And, but we were able to declare victory because China came and said, oh, I took 400 million people out of poverty. Okay, so it's done. And people applauded and said, we managed to reduce poverty by 50% thanks to China. But what about Africa? We don't know. Simply, there is a real problem we have.
Even now, we don't know.
We have a real problem. It's the lack of data. Where are the statistical offices in Africa? We keep asking this question. Without data, how can we develop policies? How can we measure the effectiveness of our policies? And I've been talking to all the development agencies who were bothered to talk to me about the need to support and rebuild these statistical offices. And I'm not getting much traction. I recall a conversation a couple of years ago was the Minister of International Development in one major donor country. And I kept telling her how important is it really to support statistical offices, to rationalize really what we are doing, to know where we are doing, you know, where we are going and what's effective, what works, what doesn't work. And I said, look, the problem is you guys, when you travel to Africa and you like to take these nice photographs holding a baby outside the hospital to publish it back at home. And but you know, standing next to an office block and say statistical, oh, it doesn't look emotional. And she always fell on the floor laughing. And she said, you know what? I just came from Kenya last week, and the basic photograph I took was a baby outside a hospital. You know, we need to have some emotional stuff here, and you know, for our taxpayers. And but I said, look, for a very little cost, you are being able to rationalize what kind of hospitals you need to build, what kind of clinics, and where, and you really rationalize your work. You cannot drive a car without this panel in front of you to show you your speed, your fuel data or whatever. You don't fly a plane without data. How can you run a country, a whole country without data?
Yeah, and actually, you've said it yourself before. I remember you saying again this very, very point that without data, we drive blind, policies are misdirected, and progress on the road to development is stunted. Now, who is responsible for closing that data gap? Who is responsible? Where do we start?
Our governments are responsible, first above all, because we need to take care of ourselves before we ask others to help us. And if our governments are not paying enough attention to this, I don't understand why. Why are not paying attention to this? It is something important to rationalize their policies, effectiveness of their policy. And that should be a great target for any company. For any country. I mean, look at any company, any business. You cannot run a business without data, without information. And but many of our leaders think they can run the country just by, you know, good wish and just, you know, feeling what is the air, where the air is blowing. I mean, that is rubbish. And also, we ask the international development agencies, guys, you say you are more scientific and more developed and smart, and okay, be smart. Insist on supporting this statistical, at least for you to know what is the effectiveness of what you are doing over there. Unfortunately, they still love to take pictures carrying babies, and it's really unfortunate.
Yeah,
So
I think that's a very
it has to be said before we start our discussion.
Yes,
because it's about reliable data to know where we are.
And data, if anything at all, because as you're saying, there's simply no data. And I'm just wondering more if from the Africa Center for Statistics of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Oliver Chinganya, you are from that center, you are the director, you are hearing the frustration here by Mo Ibrahim, who also, by the way, publishes his annual governance index and leadership index as well. What's your take on this, rather?
No, thank you very much. I don't know Dr. Mo Ibrahim very well, but if I may also call him Mo, I think he raises really very critical issues here about data, and by asking where are the national statistical offices, and also pointing to the solution. The solution really is rationalizing, governments rationalizing their policies and investing in the statistics, and that's lacking because many of our countries, they have very well set up national statistical system. And governments say statistics is very, very important. But when you look at the resource allocation, if you look at their own annual budgets, you look at resources that go to statistics, it's meager in most of these countries, literally nothing. And yet they all claim this is a public good, just like they would save a school, a road, but there are no resources. The staff that are there is a high turnover of staff because they run away from those working for the national statistical offices because they're not well looked after. They go to the private sector, and you continue providing capacity building in these offices, and there's people keep on being chunked out because there's no process. So really, it's about putting the priorities in the right place, ensuring that governments are able to invest in data and also in the technology that is required. I mean, COVID itself has showed us in the last couple of months that the national statistical systems are so weak. In most of them, they actually closed down because most of their activities, they have to have a face-to-face interaction with the data supplier. But the data supplier was not there. The marketeers were not there to give them the data. And even the ones that are collecting the data were not there because they were scared of being infected of COVID.
Oliver, on that point, just listening to you, then do you think we don't know whether actually Africa made any progress on any of these SDGs or not during this COVID-19 because there is no data?
To some extent, one would say yes. I think we in some areas we're not able to collect the data. I mean, that's a fact. But the beauty about statistics is that you are able to project. There are methodologies that allows to do projections based on what you've had in the past, taking into assumptions, to make the adjustment and so forth. So we are able to do that. We are even able to estimate what is expected. For instance, in 2030 around poverty, our estimate is that if we continue the way it is without having to determine the accelerators to improve on SDGs, we are probably talking about another 570 million people being left in poverty. But if at all, with the COVID now, if you take into account, you're probably talking an addition of about 37 million people added by 2030 if nothing is done. If the economies don't even, recover from COVID, for instance, in the next 3 years. So we are in a very bad state. We are unlikely to attain SDGs unless we invest deliberate policies, as Dr. Ibrahim was talking about, rationalizing, government realizing that data is important, not just by mouth, but by real putting the finger where it's supposed to.
What will make governments realize that data is important? We've got to find out what the problem is.
I think it's a discussion that needs to be raised at a much higher level, because they all know, as I said earlier on, they all say data is very, very important. If you talk to a politician, no, we cannot do anything without data. We cannot measure anything without having data. But do you actually put money to invest in there? So somehow there is a feeling that someone else is going to do this for them, but putting in the resources, which won't happen. We've seen it in the last 12 months or so, that even development partners are now reluctant to put resources towards data improvement and so forth. They're able to provide solutions like technology and so forth, but government must have a larger share to ensure that we have the right technology to modernize the statistical system that chunk out data in a very timely manner.
So Oliver, just back to you and Mo, I want you to draw for me a picture. I want us to get away from the debate around availability or lack of availability of data and just go to the reality that there is poverty. There is extreme poverty, and millions more are going to go into extreme poverty. Millions more of Africans living on less than $1.90 per day. What does poverty mean? What does it look like to you? Because forget about the data you don't have, but look at that reality of somebody who's living in poverty. What does it look like to you? What picture do you have in your mind, Oliver?
Poverty is a very relative term, and this is why when the CEO of Afrobarometer was presenting, he presented a situation where in some areas countries have done very well, but in some cases countries have not done very well. It's very relative, depends on what is being measured. If you ask my grandmother in the village, and she has 12 cattle, she has a field, she eats very well, and you ask her, do you think you're I come from Zambia.
Zambia, okay, go on.
Yes.
And which was the name of the village?
The name of the village in Shilimbe in Mapanza, which is in the southern part of the country.
Okay.
So if you ask her, and she owns these animals, she's got people that work for her, she'll probably not say that she's poverty-stricken. She's actually saying they are better. I'm better off than some of other people that don't even have anything. I'm even able to hire some people to come and work for me. So it's a very difficult term to deal with, depending at the time when it's being asked. So the reality is we are talking about leaving no one behind by 2030, meaning that people must live a life that is, you can see improvement over the period. Okay. They've moved from one place into another box and into another box, and they can see themselves getting better and better. If they were living in a hut with the mud house, maybe now it is brick, and now they can manage to buy irons. They're moving, they can see themselves getting better and better.
More.
So that's how I would describe poverty.
Thank you. More, draw for me that picture.
Well, I think what our friends in Afrobarometers and the people who try to have a feel of what is when people are hungry or poor or whatever, they try to ask some indirect question, because you ask somebody, are you poor or rich? I mean, it can be subjective. They ask questions like, did you have dinner last night, or how many times, just they try to get an angle on what is going on by asking this kind of questions, to move away from this objective concepts of hunger. From what we see, whatever available in terms of data or surveys, etc., including, of course, Afrobarometers, my personal impression is the following. Yes, hunger is increasing in Africa, and poverty is increasing in Africa. And this pandemic made things much worse, because we asked people to be locked up in homes. Okay. And many of our people go out to earn living day by day. Okay. They are not really in formal economy, receiving salaries. And in the West, government said to people to stay at home. You know what? I'm going to send you your money. I'm going to send you your salary. So just stay at home. And then they have their internet, they order their food, they order this, and it's fine. Actually, the financial indicators in the West is that people's savings has grown up during the last year, because people saved a lot of money sitting at home, receiving their salaries, not going out, spending the money. So economically, a lot of people, became better financially. That's not the situation in Africa. Our business did not receive any support from governments. That's different from what happened in the West. Our people since then did not receive. There is no safety net in Africa for our people. There's no safety net, and so it is tough. I just came last week from this conference in a summit, in what they call a summit of the financing of the African economies in Paris, which President Macron invited African leaders and national institutions, and it was an interesting meeting. And it appears the only way Africa can get support, because we are fighting to do something about the debt, to increase the amount of support Africa need, because the point is that African countries cannot borrow money. And if they can borrow money, they cannot borrow it cheaply. This is the issue.
And then it becomes that vicious cycle. Hold on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, hold on to that. Hold on to that idea more for a while. I just want to bring in Margot to this. First of all, Nedal Sweli, who's just sent in a message saying, we are a research company based in Libya, and my experience is that the main issue is not data availability, but the challenge is the limited demand for data and evidence-based policy design. Data can be collected using many feasible choices, but building demand for data consumption is the real challenge in Nedal's opinion. Let's bring in Honorable Margot Wallström. You've been listening to all this, and you are from Sweden. You are the former Swedish Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister as well. Sweden actually is ranking #1 in terms of being able to make progress on all the 17, nearly all the 17 SDGs. So there's no poverty in Sweden. Let's just take that one first of all to the bank. There is no poverty in Sweden.
Well, not compared to the situation in many African countries. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you, and congratulations to Dr. Joe Asumka, who's taking on the CEO job of Afrobarometer, and congratulations to starting off with these amazing scorecards and being able to present that. I agree that the question now is, how will this be used? Will governments care about what these scorecards say? Because these are the voices and the proof of what people feel and think about the Sustainable Development Goals. And the African continent, African countries are young. A very young population. So they are the future of your countries as well in Africa. So we really hope that also governments will listen to what young people think about the policies. You know, what I have seen is, somebody asked here, what does poverty looks like? Very often it has a woman's face, because women have more precarious jobs. Women are overall, they have lower wages. They are in jobs that are not so well paid, and women are often poorer than men. Also when it comes to well, both salaries and fortunes. So I think that very, very important to discuss, of course, how to fight poverty, because what we've seen with the pandemic is that it discriminates. It discriminates against older people. It discriminates against the ones who are already very exposed to problems of all kinds. And this means that there will be more poverty and hunger from the pandemic. The fallout is also very tough on especially women, because they work on the front lines of the pandemic as healthcare workers, as nurses, and all of that. And when they are at home and closed in with a partner that is violent, we also see those phenomena on the increase. So much more of domestic violence is reported, and that is in many, many countries. I really think it is for the United Nations to measure how all member states are doing when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, to follow up and report back and keep track on how we are doing, because this is a global undertaking, it's a global commitment, something for the first time where all the UN countries and member states have agreed that this is the roadmap to the future. And you cannot choose only one. You have to see that this is a holistic plan for and roadmap for the future. So I think that as much as we can be happy for being a wealthy country, I think that we also have a lot of challenges and a lot of problems to deal with. And I think inequality is the biggest challenge to also our societies that are sort of rich and wealthy and also democratic, because that is another, you could say, result of the pandemic. We see that there are attacks against our democratic structures. Restrictions have been maybe necessary, but many of the autocrats that rule the world are now trying to keep that also when the pandemic hopefully fades away. Yeah. So I think you have an enormous strength in the young population that you have in your countries. And I think just one thing that I have noticed myself also traveling in Africa, that, for example, child marriages, they are an obstacle to being able to fight poverty. So there are too many child marriages, women, they give birth to up to 7-8 children. How do you get out of poverty if this is sort of the solution in a very difficult economic and social situation?
Honorable,
and we have help, of course.
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to the picture you painted of poverty, and you said it's got a face of a woman. And I'll just go to one of the SDGs where Sweden is working closely with African governments, and that is SDG number 7, and that is on affordable and clean energy. And I know that your government is investing mainly in solar power and hydropower in countries such as Zambia, where Oliver Chinganya comes from. Oliver, that's your country. Your grandmother is in Mapanza, and it's one of the countries Sweden is partnering with, together with Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Uganda. And you're focusing on clean and affordable energy, especially when you consider, according to ADB's statistics, that 600,000 people die every year, mainly are women and children, because of respiratory diseases, because of using wood to cook, and therefore they inhale the poisonous gases and die. And I'm just wondering, what is the progress so far in what your government is doing with African countries, the ones that are mentioned?
Well, maybe I'm not the right person to give you all the, I'm not totally updated, since I left almost a couple of years ago already, the government, so I don't have all the figures, but I know that this is something, a long-term commitment that we have, and with many African countries, and with very concrete projects. And I think this is looking at the future. If we actually invest in sustainable energy systems. So I do believe that this is one of the areas where we will continue to invest in energy and transportation systems that are also good for the climate, because this is the survival challenge for all of us, to make sure that we adapt and adjust to climate change. And I would say also environmental problems, because this is how very often these pandemics start. So if we want to avoid having another one already next year, we'd better look at what are the root causes and what can we do about it. But definitely we will continue with both the foreign direct investment, with the climate change and sustainable development projects with Africa, also from the Swedish side. And I think, this must go both ways. We also learn from being with African partners. And I think Afrobarometer is something that you can be an example with this. And I hope that the European Union could do something similar also, checking if the Eurobarometer, maybe Dr. Asunka, if the Eurobarometer has done anything similar. Otherwise, I really think that we could compare, we could look at what does citizens say about the progress on these important goals.
Yeah, Dr. Asunka, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've worked with the Eurobarometer and other global barometers, and the questions we normally ask are similar. And I can know that they would have questions. Of course, they will have the data on this. Whether or not they have developed the indicators, no. But we're thinking this is a pioneering project, and we're hoping that this becomes one of the signature products that several barometers across the world can also use. And we can have citizen perspectives complementing data that is produced by governments.
Exactly.
Okay, and just while you're still there, before I go to Mo and Oliver once again, just while you're there, Joseph, there's a question. First, a comment from Rachel Bowers, who says, do we deliberately underfund data and evidence so the population is oblivious to the issues, thereby not demand accountability? The thing is that if you keep on collecting and publishing data, the population will become aware and they will demand accountability. So are governments deliberately keeping these things away from the public eye? Then Sunday Duntoye says, how can we incorporate or improve the model in Afrobarometer surveys and dissemination plans towards supporting poverty reduction? Briefly, Joseph.
Right. So, I mean, so the first question, that's a great question to ask. Is it a deliberate thing that to keep people in the dark, and as long as they're in the dark, they probably wouldn't know what's happening? And I think that is one of the things where openness and transparency is key, because we believe that, when governments are open and transparent about what they do, it's helpful for everybody. But of course, if you don't want to be seen, keeping things under wraps or keeping them in the dark is a possible way to go. Whether or not governments are deliberately doing this, I can't tell, and that's a good research question to look into, because sometimes it can be deliberate to keep people in the dark so they don't hold you accountable because they are not aware of what is happening. But I think that's a gap that Afrobarometer tries to fill. That if we don't have official data on particular indicators, we will go out, we will ask the people about their experiences and their evaluations of what is happening and bring that data to light, and we will put it out in the public domain. And so, as I said, whether or not there's official statistics and whether or not it is deliberate. We have institutions like Afrobarometer that plays that complementary role. We bring the data out in a way, and that is real people's evaluations and assessments of their own living experiences, which can be useful in both complementing any data that governments provide, but also filling the gaps that actually exist that everybody has alluded to here.
Okay, and Mo, I'm going to come to you. There's a question for you here. But the Institute for African Women in Law says, at the Institute for African Women in Law, we have launched the gender scorecard to track women in judicial and legal institutions. My question is, can international institutions like the AU or UN make it a compulsory requirement for national government institutions to keep up to date data for researchers like us? More, do we make this compulsory?
Yeah, you see, one problem actually is that the African Union has no power to compel any African country to do anything, which is sad because it's a club for presidents who meet every 1 or 2 years and hug each other, and it's a nice place for presidents to be in. We keep arguing that we need to put the union in the African Union because we have to delegate some sovereignty to the African Union if we have to move forward. We need to open our borders. We need to, you look at the European Union. I mean, these great European countries agreed to delegate certain authorities to the European Commission. And that's why it is possible to create the common market. It's possible to harmonize policies. They're trying to do the vaccine, so they try to have a European market, negotiate better deals and whatever. We are 54 countries. We cannot, unfortunately, unwilling to delegate any authority to the African Union. So the short answer to your question, it cannot be done by forcing a country or compelling them to do it. The demand from people, and also I think the demand also from the development agencies, that carries weight as well. I mean, because where development agencies spend their money is their prerogative. And I haven't seen any of these development agencies saying, okay, this money I'm allocating to a statistical office. None. I was in a meeting with a number of people, including the Chancellor Merkel, some years ago, and she was keep insisting on outcomes. Say, we have to know the outcomes. And I ask, okay, how do you know the outcomes if you don't measure? It is inconsistent. People cannot see it. Even sophisticated people like Angela Merkel. I mean, you want to measure the outcome, invest in statistical offices. So simple as that. I don't know what is the Swedish position on that. I mean, you guys are a great, generous company with a long history of being supportive of African countries. Why did you insist that some of your money should go to build this statistical office?
Honorable Wallström, come in briefly. Some of your money could actually go into aiding those institutions, strengthen them. We need data.
Well, that's for sure. Every government needs to make sure that there is proper, reliable statistics. And for example, we have argued a lot also about having it gender disaggregated and so on. As Joe pointed out also about these scorecards, that you have to look at them so that they are representative. And I think at least, the question can be put to governments when we meet, when we have an exchange, or when we have projects. What about your statistical facts and data? So this is important, and I think also for the African Union it's important, even though there is no sort of legislative power given to the African Union. You can have a cooperation, you can compare, you can say what are the best sort of ways to build up our statistical bureaus and get all the necessary information. So I think this is where it starts. So an exchange of experiences and maybe support as well where that is needed.
Yeah, and there is Francis Afulani who's saying, can the development partners demand more accountability for how the funds they provide are utilized? It seems that there is so much misappropriation of funds by governments, yet they keep pouring in more money. So countries like Sweden, they want to invest in, of course, that is SDG number 7 about clean and affordable energy. But again, if the results are not being seen, how do you account for that? Just briefly.
Yeah, no, and I mean, when it comes to our development project, of course, there is a follow-up, and it is necessary to check, to make everybody accountable for how the funds are being used. So this happens regularly and must be also explained to Swedish taxpayers, where their money goes. So I think that it's part of the process, but it's more about what to measure, what kind of statistics does a country need, and how do you build it up if you don't have that competence to begin with, or if you don't have the resources, where do you start, and how do you make sure that you get a good system and a good structure for collecting data.
Right, Oliver, let me just come to you and use Kesha Kabeli's question. What kind of leverage do governments have to negotiate with the private sector so that the private sector can provide information they have collected, which the government needs to draw policies? That kind of partnership, public and private.
Thank you. But maybe before I address that, if I may, we have in Africa what is called the African Charter on Statistics. This is an agreement, with regulations and principles, which was signed by heads of states in 2009, agreeing that they are going to ensure that statistics becomes a public good. And then we have the strategy on harmonization of statistics, which is called the SASHA, which brings all the regional agencies that are supporting statistics to abide with that, to follow that in terms of providing the data. And at country level, they have a national strategy on development of statistics. This is the roadmap. And that roadmap is supposed to be associated with the National Development Plan and the budgeting process. But these things are there, but in terms of are they being implemented? That's the big question. In terms of engaging the private sector, to be very honest, because official data, first of all, from National Statistical Office has always been viewed as official statistics. And official statistics, by nature, everyone wants to say it is only data that goes to inform government processes, data that is collected by the national statistical offices, and data that is collected other than those ones becomes questionable. So it is only now that there is a move to begin to engage with the private sector. Because they realize that they've got the capacity, they've got the tools, they've got the means to produce and make available in real time, for instance, Google, FaceMap, and so forth, through big data. So there's now a process of really bringing in and embracing the private sector. And I think the national statistical offices in countries, they have to take a lead in identifying the right partners in there. But not just the private sector, but also the academia. Because the academia, they've got the means for research, they can develop methodologies, they can also bridge what I call theoretical statistics, which is at the university, and development statistics, and perhaps begin to influence even the curriculum. So I think now there's room, especially COVID, I think that's provided that opportunity to engage the private sector, because everyone now realizes they have the technology, they have the means and the tools to be able to support the national statistical system. So it's a new thing for the government, because they've never really engaged. They've always questioned anything data that comes from the private sector. They would not want to bring in as official data. But now there's a change, because they realize that you need to have this data in real time, other than having to wait for a census, where you only get the data after such a long time, or even for surveys.
And thanks for that. I'll just quickly bring in a comment. You may not, nobody will have to answer this because of time. And then I'll come to you, Joseph. This is from Gary Rawlings, Managing Director for Natam UK Limited, and says that supplying solutions for SDG number 6, and that's on water and sanitation projects. And he says, does the panel agree that this is one of the main building blocks? Is going to be quickly building blocks to have in place in the building of strong economies and safeguarding the populations of each and every country that participates with this very important requirement, that's access to clean water and sanitation. But the question for you, Joseph, is from Sandy Duntoye, who says, how can we incorporate or improve the model in Afrobarometer surveys and dissemination plans towards supporting poverty reduction?
Well, I mean, this is one of the things, and that's why we are launching this as scorecards today, because we wanted it to coincide with African Union Day, which is tomorrow, but to draw attention to the fact that there is data out there that can be brought to the discussion table in terms of debates on what is to be done. But let me just get back briefly to some of the measures that Mo had talked about in terms of when we are capturing poverty. And I would put the submission and ask a question directly to UNECA to hear what they have to say about Afrobarometer data and how it can complement what they do. So when it comes to poverty issues, we ask people directly about their experiences. It's not about just asking bluntly, are you poor or are you rich? It's more about asking people, how many times have you gone without food in the past 12 months? Or did you not have food? So it's practical things that allows people to recall their experiences over a certain period, over the last 12 months, typically. And so if you have gone without medical care, or the medical care you received was not of the quality you had hoped for, or if you have been hungry over a period of time, these are things that people recall. And that is how we construct our indices. And these are based on people's real experiences and not necessarily just whether or not they are rich or poor. But with that, I just wanted to ask Mr. Ching, in terms of Afrobarometer data and how it actually feeds into government statistics. You've already alluded to the fact that governments are increasingly incorporating private sector data. So mobile telephony is one area where lots of governments are now building in. Satellite data we know is coming into the space. We have citizen voices that exist out there, and this is what Afrobarometer is able to document consistently and over time. The question to you is, how can this data that we collect make its way into the monitoring efforts that UNECA and others do on the continent?
Thank you, Joe, for that question. I wasn't expecting a question from you other than the moderator, but this is good for me too.
That is just for you. He's owning the statistics.
I know that Solomon was going to come to it, and I was like, okay, now that I'm talking, let me just ask you.
Exactly.
Thank you. No, first of all, really, let me say that the new Afrobarometer SDGs scorecard, it's a very welcome initiative. And I think that with the tools that we have developed here at ECA, and which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, I think it will be very useful to bring the citizens to be able to understand what is going on. The issue really, which was partly being asked, I think, why is data not being used? We have an issue of statistical literacy in our countries. There are not many people that really understand what is required, and the result, even the demand for data is minimal because we don't have people. People are not literally educated on statistics. That's part of it. But coming back to how we can actually integrate this work that Afrobarometer is doing, we have at ECA developed a very, very robust database, and part of that database we have an SDG portal, and we help to monitor progress, from 2000 going forward to 2030. And with that, we also use stoplights, we call them traffic lights, to actually see progress, what is going on. And this is data that is collected through the national statistical offices and validated and harmonized by the custodian agencies. It then goes to the global, and then we just pick out one for Africa. But in addition to that, what we have also done is that we have what we call an integrated planning and reporting tool at ECA. So this is the tool that countries are using to assess their alignment of SDGs in the National Development Plan, and hoping that they will be able also to associate that alignment with the resources required to collect the data that is required. So I see an opportunity here that if we can find ways of integrating the data that comes from here into this integrated planning reporting tool, would be a big plus, because we already have a reach to the governments. We already have a reach to the countries that are already using the integrated reporting tool. But in addition to that, we realize that the integrated planning tool somehow is not exposed to everyone. It tends to remain within the Ministry of Planning and Monitoring in some cases, and not the national statistical offices. That is where the challenge is. So we are helping countries to develop now the SDG dashboards. along with that. So I think that that dashboard, to me, would be a very good, the African Barometer scorecard would be a very good complementary resource that should be tapped into, in fact, integrated for use by the National Statistical Offices, by the researchers that access data at National Statistical Office. So it's a great initiative, and I think you should be commended for that.
Okay, I know we are drawing to a close. So if I may just seize the microphone once again from Joseph and Suka. Joseph, I've got a question for you. When we talk about poverty, would you kindly explain briefly, because I want us to wrap this up now, would you kindly explain how about poverty and why this type of data is important? How do you ask about poverty? What is it that you ask people?
Right.
Is it about
So,
what
I
you
mean,
have for dinner or lunch or breakfast?
I could ask you, of course, Solomon, I could ask you, in the last 12 months, have you gone without food? Or in the last 12 months, have you gone without medical care?
But what kind of food? Hold on. When you say food, is it just any type of food, or specifically there's food according to local, somebody's local conditions?
It's just food in general, because if you've gone hungry, it's food, like food that you need to fill your belly and feel good about yourself. And so we asked generally about food, just going without food in the past 12 months, going without clean water in the past 12 months, and also experiencing the healthcare that is of poor quality, or whether or not in the healthcare you received in the last 12 months, how you judge it. Was it good healthcare that you received? And also whether or not you are even able to access healthcare when you needed it. And so this is a range of things that allows us. And so when it comes, hunger is direct. Did you go without food during any period in the last 12 months? And people will tell us how often they've gone without food, whether it is only once or they've gone several times or many, many times. And so based on their responses, we built our index of lived poverty from that. So you have no access to food, no access to water, no access to medical care, and combining those into one indicator, signifying people's experiences of poverty. Right. But that said, of course, I know that there's the evaluations that people present is it's deeply what they themselves have experienced in the last 12 months. And I know if I'd asked you, Solomon, have you experienced these things? I may be able to assume what the answers you will give me, but of course, what you give me is a true reflection of your own experiences and not an imagination of what you expect.
And actually, it's what you said in the very beginning, just about how unique your piece of work is about drawing comments from Africans themselves, explaining their lived experience with these things we are discussing. I just want to wrap this up and come back to the other panelists as well, because we've all been talking about data and expressing frustration about lack of data. And once again, back to that quote, without data, we drive blind, policies are misdirected, and progress on the road to development is stunted. We must all act urgently to close the data gap. Those are your words, Mo Ibrahim. I'm just thinking, with or without data, what would be the repercussions if the SDGs are not met in Africa?
Right. Okay.
If we don't have a scorecard, obviously we have no motivation to do better. The whole idea of having a scorecard is to know where we're coming from, where we're going, and to see how much of the task has been achieved. Do we need to work harder? It motivates people to meet a target. But if we just forget about that and keep modeling on, of course we'll not meet any of these targets. And the amount of data now, and I thought it's not complete, but I mean it gives a reasonable picture of what's going on, shows that we're missing out. This is the fact, we're missing out. And actually, the effect of COVID has not hit us yet. We should be braced for a big hit, and our economies are really, for first time in 20 years, Africa is going into recession. This is one area, at least Africa was doing reasonably well by having annual growth of 4% or 5%, whatever It is, although I must accept the point made early on about the explosion in our population, because on average, in many countries, a woman will have 6 children during the span of life. That number is very high. And somehow in Africa, we are too shy to speak about family planning. And people seem to be proud that half the young people in 20 years will be African. And
the largest labor force by 2030.
I heard one of the presidents last week in Paris was posting really that half of the working people in the world in 30 years will be African. And I thought that was a mistake. Maybe half the young population will be African. Doesn't mean half the working people are African, because our guys don't have work. So having too many people without work, I mean, that's explosive.
Or rather, the skills that will be necessary at that moment, the skills is very important.
That's an issue. I think we should not be shy to talk about this. We really
but isn't the way out of poverty is, of course, education. Also for people in Africa, you have to make sure that people can have both boys and girls can have an education.
But Margot, the point to argue as always is that if you have 6 children, it is too expensive to try to educate them. And none of them will be educated. But if you have only 2 children, maybe you can educate them.
That was my point also, that you have to make sure that you fight, for example, child marriages, because if a girl is married away when she's 14 or 15, she will give birth, she will never go to school, and she will give birth to maybe 7 or 8 children. Absolutely. And that will make it so much more difficult to get out of poverty. So I think this is not easy. I know that. And people often do this because they think they help also the young girls. If she can get married, at least she has somebody that will care for her. So I think that, the motives can be good, but for a country, this will be a big obstacle to actually fighting poverty. But I want to say that this kind of the scorecards and this kind of statistics, that unfortunately very often the naming and shaming helps, but you wish that government ministers and those who steer your country would know their country and the life of the people in their countries well enough to understand if there is poverty, if people are hungry, if there are such inequalities in a country that you really have to deal with, and not only rely, of course, on a scorecard, but it helps us. And I really hope that around the world, also in my country, that we can measure and see how are we doing and how do people perceive this, because this is also the voices of your people in all of those countries in Africa now. With the help of Afrobarometer, you will have a picture of what people feel and think about the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are things we cannot avoid. We have to do something about climate change. We have to do something about the environment. We have to make sure we fight poverty and help people lift. And of course, an enormous resource with all these young Africans.
Yeah, you've made a very compelling point, Honorable Wallström. I want to come to you, Oliver, but you had just challenged Mo there. Mo, just briefly in the last 20 seconds for you, what's your takeaway from today's session? 20 seconds, please. Mo.
Hey?
Yes.
Any
takeaway? 20 seconds, yeah, just briefly. What's your takeaway?
I mean, I really love what Afrobarometer is doing, and we rely on them to really get data on the voice of the African people, because we compile our index for African governance, and we have like 36 or 37 sources of data. But many of these data also, like take the data of corruption. How Transparency International get the data of corruption? They ask business people. Many of them are non-Africans, they're outsiders to tell them if they experience corruption in Africa. That's fine. Business, corruption in business. But what Afrobarometers give us, on the other hand, is what is the experience of the African citizen with corruption?
Mhm.
You know, do they have to pay the teacher? Do they have to pay the policeman? Do they have to pay this? How do you experience corruption in daily life? I think that complements what we're trying to do.
Excellent.
So I really wish to applaud Afrobarometer, and I wish they continue to do what they're doing, and I hope more people come to support them because they're always short of money. And, I think, Margot, you should really help ask your friends in Sweden to really support those guys because we need more of data there.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in 20 seconds, Oliver Chinganya, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, first of all, on the repercussions, I think repercussions are the gaps are going to increase much, much worse. And I think people will be living more or less the way pre-independence. Yeah. They will be living in the big houses, but poorer than they were now. So what's the takeaway? I think these are complementary efforts. After Afrobarometer with EC, I think we want to really embrace this work, this initiative that Joe is leading, and see how we can actually work together and ensure that these voices at country level begin to hear them. They're not in numbers. People must begin to associate themselves in the numbers they see, in the figures that Afrobarometer is producing. Because if you talk about the GDP per capita, if my mother cannot associate herself in that GDP per capita, it's useless. Mm-hmm. So we need to find a way of associating these numbers with the people, and they can see themselves in the numbers. I think that's what I take away from this. Thank you.
I remember the president of the African Development Bank, Dr. Deshina, once saying, people don't eat GDP. Look, I want to thank Honorable Margot Wallström, former Swedish Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. We've also been hearing from Oliver Chinganya, Director at the African Center for Statistics and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He was standing in for Dr. Vera Songwe. And we also heard from Dr. Mo Ibrahim, founder and chair of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And of course, the person who opened this all is Dr. Joseph Asunka. I want to hand over to you for the last word, and then we'll thank our audience for attending. We had a very good audience, by the way. Back to you, Asunka.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Solomon. This has been really great. And thank you to our esteemed panelists, and Margot and Oliver and Mo. This is really great. We are so glad you made it. And Mo, thank you so much for putting in the pitch for us. I know this work cannot go on if we do not have the support. And so we're hoping that we'll continue to do this work. And this is work that we are passionate about. We believe in the fact that people's voices must count in policy making. And we're really committed to this effort. The more we can get support to continue to do this, I think the better for us all. And we can help to fill some of the data gaps that we all complain about. We bring people's voices to fill some of these gaps and inform policy decision making. So thank you all for making the time, and we wish you the very best for the rest of the day.
And on dot, 90 minutes are over. Thank you, and our audience, thank you. I'm sure your comments will be captured by Afrobarometer. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.